Hello, everybody. Jason Haas here. Welcome to the Wednesday Instagram Live Tablas Creek conversation. My guest this week is a friend and a winemaker who I admire for lots of reasons. This is Morgan Twain Peterson of Bedrock Wine Company. He has a really cool history in wine, and he's also doing, I think, some of the most important and innovative stuff that's going on in California. So I will be asking him to join in just a couple of minutes, but meanwhile, while we wait for people to sign on, I thought I would do what I usually do and share some pictures of what it looks like here at the winery. So start there. It is gorgeous. We've had basically 3.5 weeks of cold nights and sunny days on top of 12 inches of rain that we got in December. And so everything is unbelievably green. We've been sending the sheep through the vineyard. They are they're in full evidence. You can hear them from almost anywhere. We've got 200 sheep and another 200 lambs. The flock is exciting. It has, when I say it's been cold at night, like I'm not joking. It has been frosty, as I took this morning. It's dropped down below freezing most mornings over the last 3 weeks. That is normal. It's not a bad thing at all. This time of year, it's good. Keeps everything dormant. And then it warms up into the 70s, 60s, maybe hit 70 once in a while. Give you a few senses of how green it is. One more picture of the fact that even though it hasn't rained in 3 weeks, my boots were drenched after walking around for 20 minutes. So there's plenty of moisture in the ground. It looks like it is supposed to get wet again when we get into February. And that's great. We're at like 125% of normal rainfall for the winter at this point. And we would definitely like some more. In the cellar, the big news is that we've been bottling. This morning, we've been bottling the Patalenda Tablas Rosé 2021, which is exciting. We've been out of rosé for almost 6 months. It's lovely to have it back. The other two things that we've been bottling this week have been our Dianthus and our Vermentino. Which is great because I love those wines, but even more exciting, these are the first wines that we've bottled that carry that regenerative organic certified seal, and that's something which we are super proud of. It will be on all of our estate wines going forwards, 2021 vintage going forwards. So look for that when you see these out in the world, and we're excited that like 4 years into this work, they will finally be out in the world. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. I am going to invite Morgan to join me. I saw him sign on earlier, so request to join. Okay, invite to join. Invitation. Morgan, say yes, and we'll be on screen. Hey,
How's it going?
good. How you doing, buddy?
Good. I'm glad to see you in al fresco as well. I figured this was a good opportunity to take advantage of some sunshine, albeit chilly sunshine, and get out into the vineyard a little bit. So,
yeah, I try to do these outside. Every now and then, like there's actual weather in Paso Robles and it chases me inside. But I think I've been driven inside maybe 3 times in the better part of 2 years.
yeah.
Welcome to California.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I think like looking at your photos, we've been doing a lot of the same, which has required me to be inside doing rosé bottling, white bottling, all the end of year stuff. So I always feel like I'm a little vineyard deprived because it's kind of hard. Like we're pruning, but it's not like anything is actively growing. So there's not any real reason to be checking on things outside of just, wanting to, frolic through the greenness out here. So.
Yeah, I end up frolicking through the greenness kind of at least once a week because I need content to write a blog about. So I sort of force myself out into the vineyard just to kind of assess where things are, and it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, nice to have a good excuse. So.
For sure. Okay, so I gave a little teaser for you when we first got started. But I love to get started just by asking people to kind of tell their path into wine. And I know your path into wine is in some ways a little like mine in that you grew up grew up in a wine family doing wine stuff. But share this for people who maybe don't know it.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I think it was a function of how well our fathers sold us on the entire process. Something that I am now thinking about more as I have a 16-month-old now and being like, oh, how do I make this look cool? But no, I was raised by a very, very passionate winemaking father, and Joel Peterson, who started Ravenswood Winery. And, he sort of came at it from a non-traditional course. He came at it from a cancer immunology background and just like was tasting all the time on the side. My grandparents were really the first to get into wine. My grandmother, in fact, she and my grandfather met isolating plutonium in Northridge, Tennessee. And then being the 50s, though, unfortunately, when they got back and had kids, my grandfather went and worked for Shell Development, and my grandmother got to be a school teacher, even though by all accounts she was the better chemist of the two. She was the first woman to graduate Phi Beta Kappa from Berkeley in chemistry. And a gene, by the way, which did not get passed on to me at all. But basically, the story goes that, she was just extraordinarily bored while having like my little rugrat dad running around, and really started to sort of apply her chemistry skills to cooking. And in the process of cooking, really discovered an avenue into wine. And so like she still has the original receipt from the 12 bottles that she bought from a shop in San Francisco called the City of Paris. And it was like basically like the best selections of France. And it was actually a bottle of 1945 Chateauneuf de Pape that they had at Thanksgiving in the 1950s that just like opened, like just something clicked, and they became huge wine people. They started doing their own tasting groups. My grandmother became like the test. She tested all the recipes for Alice Waters for all the original Japanese cookbooks. And in the process, my dad was exposed to a lot of wine, and that sort of stuck with him. So we always joke that if that bottle of Chateauneuf de Pape had been 44 or 46, our lives might be quite a little bit different. But also a good reminder of the power of Grenache and Morvet.
Seriously,
Yeah,
and the power of like wine to tell a story of a moment. Like, you imagine the conditions that they were working under in making wine in France in 1945. Like, it's unbelievable.
The fact that it is such a legendary vintage and that the quality was so good, I mean, those wines truly probably kind of made themselves, like in a way that we always say that they do. But there's not a lot of bandwidth, not a lot of bodies, just was a really challenging time. So yeah, it's so crazy. And yeah, and my dad, it was interesting because everybody thinks of Ravenswood as like this global behemoth, which is what it became. But when I was growing up, my dad started it in '76, working out of Joe Swan Winery in Russian River Valley. He was making a couple hundred cases. And so like when I was growing up, Ravenswood was my dad's second gig. He ran the laboratory at the bacteriology at the local hospital. And then he'd be going and doing punch downs at night and doing press offs. And like, I would be sleeping, at the lab or at the winery. So it's cold enough. I'm going to actually just move while I talk, get out into the sun a little bit. So it was, there, that's better. So for me, it was just always a serious passion project for my dad, so I got to see that really up close. And it was really not until like I was in high school that all of a sudden Ravenswood began to grow, like, and become what it was. And it was like in 1998 they went public to finance the building of a new winery. I was 17 years old, so it's sort of like the what Ravenswood is in everybody's heads now is sort of like very much later on in my life. What I associate it with is like my dad just really busting his ass all the time for something that he really, really loved. So I think that sort of got passed on to me in some ways.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. So when you were growing up, and your dad was working, like doing Ravenswood, but also working his day job.
Yep.
Like, to what extent were you around the wine piece of it? I mean, you said you were like hanging out at the winery, and I know that there's like one of the things buried in your bio is you made your first vintage when you were 5.
Yeah.
So what was wine like? Did you feel like wine was everywhere as you were growing up?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely a constant. My dad was always very intellectually engaged with it. It was very open for, one, like I would always be out with him in vineyards, so I'd be tasting fruit, I'd be, looking, seeing the interactions with growers, and there's as many characters now as there were then, so you sort of like get to sort of see a different facet, which I still find very interesting to this day. And then, at home we were always trying different wines, and I was always allowed to have like a little sip if I was interested, or if I wasn't, that was fine too. But and then also like even moving forward in middle school and high school, like at one point my dad was making this wine called Vintner's Blend, which was where he was buying a lot of bulk wine and tasting through hundreds of samples as he was assembling it. And my job was to basically set up those tastings, and then what I ended up doing was actually tasting with him. And so in many ways it became like a fault seminar. He'd be like, that's reduction, that's that's methyl mercaptan, that's not good. This wine's way too oaky, but like maybe it'll actually work in the context of a blend.
Right.
This is Alicante Boucher, it's pure color. Like stuff like that. So I think that from the beginning, you sort of start to start tasting and learning wine from like the inside out in some ways.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of cool that I was always able to sort of like be right there with it. And in a way, I don't think that opportunity would really have been available 10 years or 20 years later, when Ravens became far more
Right.
corporate, and like that just wouldn't. So in some ways I look back on it now and I go like, wow, that was actually like really unique. It was just like my life when I was growing up. But it's kind of cool to think back on then, that it was just like my dad and his like 14-year-old kid, like going through like, tasting, assembling Vintner's Blend.
It feels like it feels a little bit like in what you've done with Bedrock that you've tried to kind of recreate those early years of Ravenswood or something along that model where you're working on kind of a vineyard by vineyard level, working with individual wines with vines that you're helping farm, or the people who are farming. Was that consciously in your head?
Yeah, I mean, I think we saw in the beginning of Ravenswood that there is a really compelling model there. That my dad, and the one thing that I would say that my dad really passed on is, and one of the gifts he handed down is that he's always been an incredibly kind and generous person, and so and he was always that way with his growers. And so like when it came to start Bedrock, I think that thought me a little bit of extra room, because I could go to a grower and be like, hey, would you mind working with me? I'm small, like I can't take that much. And I think, instead of being like, I mean, there's other people in the industry that, haven't been that nice to people, but, I think they're like, this is Joel Peterson's kid, like we'll give him a shot. And then obviously we sort of had to work from there. So, I mean, that part of it has just sort of been inherited. And we still work with some growers that my dad started working with in like the early 80s. Like we're going into like 4 decades of working with like the Taldeskis up in Dry Creek. So some of it was just working and parlaying some of those relationships and resources. But again, I think fundamentally my dad's, that sort of crucible of vineyards that Ravenswood was built around, Old Hill Ranch, Taldeski, Dickerson, those, that also was, at the time very important, because it showed just how incredibly important single vineyard and old vines, like what these expressions were. And I think with Bedrock, it's sort of like a more modern take on that, and also not even talking about the story of Zinfandel, but talking about the story of actually how genetically diverse these old vineyards
Right.
are. And there's a lot, like it's a lot more complex story in these vineyards than was being told in the 90s. And luckily we live in a time where we can tell a much more complex story about what's going on in these vineyards. And then the other major part I would say that's different from Ravenswood, and I think it was just a bandwidth thing because my dad had to be like on the road selling wine all the time, is like we farm the majority of our vineyards and we oversee, or we are partnered in the farming of them. And to me, that's like the next step forward from both a qualitative standpoint, but also from a sustainability and regenerative standpoint. Like there's a lot of, we have very progressive farming practices, and, sometimes these old vineyards are farmed by old school people. So, we have to be able to, have the conversation and tell them why it's a good idea to plant a cover crop and why it's a good idea to not necessarily use, synthetic pesticides and stuff like that. And actually engage in that conversation as well. So I think that that's where we've been able to sort of push it to the next level.
Yeah. Cool. So at what point you're not very many American winemakers who has a master of wine.
Yeah.
How did you decide to do that? And tell people a little bit about what it was that you wrote about.
Yeah. So I guess part of it was, there's always that thing when you're like doing the same gig that your dad had, that you want to kind of prove that you didn't just stumble into it because it was the easy thing to do, and that you actually were going to come at it with some, real intellectual, some thought, and, you're there for a purpose. And, that was part of it. The other part of it was I naturally had a pretty strong academic background. I liked writing essays. Like I have a master's in American studies as well. So it's sort of like in the MW is kind of a weird Venn diagram of skills. Like you have to be able to taste really well, but then you also have to like be able to like spit out like perfect 5-paragraph essays on enology, viticulture, and wine business. And, so it's just like this sort of like, you have to somehow have all those skills. And like when I came out of graduate school, I was like, well, I'm a pretty good taster. I can write. So like, let's maybe like go after this. And I certainly think I'm really happy I did then, because I think it would be a much more difficult process for me to go through now, where some of those skills have maybe calcified or deteriorated a little bit. So I think that was part of it. And then on top of it, I just think that, the element of the Master of Wine that I really like is that it sort of forces you to contextualize where you are in the wine world in a much more international way. And it forces you to sort of think out beyond the parameters of sort of like your own life and what you're doing, which I think is just a really important thing in general in life. But I think it's very important in the wine industry to kind of understand what's going on. And, it's also, it's kind of, so that part was really interesting and important as well. So, yeah. And now, honestly, the nicest part of it is like when we travel abroad, like people usually respond to my emails like if we want to visit someplace. I mean, there's some that like that's a nice thing as well, because at least they, hopefully people know that they'll get somebody who's like, engaged and it wants to visit for the right reasons. So, by the way, this block right behind me, that's the core of the Bedrock Heritage wine. That's 1888 planted Zinfandel, Carignan, Mourvèdre, and 27 other grape varieties.
So. That was basically as soon as you'd finished that last sentence. Where are you and what are we looking at? Because it is.
Yes. So I'm right in the middle of Bedrock Vineyard. So if I turn around this way, because the secret sauce at Bedrock is that we have two blocks of very old vine Mourvèdre, Nataro that I just walked past, but then behind me is the sculpture garden here. This is 1888 planted Carignan, and this always makes up at about 20% of the Bedrock Heritage wine. And to me, it's like what really gives the wine like spice and perfume and acid and lift. And I think it really kind of helps define the Zinfandel and other elements, which can kind of sometimes be a little, it's Zinfandel. It can be a little bit rounder and bigger. So I think that sometimes the addition of sort of the sculpting element of the Carignan is really important.
So that's a good segue into ask you about the Historic Vineyard Society. So
yeah.
I think what you and the rest of that are doing is such an incredible service for kind of California wine and wine history. But for people who maybe don't know what the Historic Vineyard Society is, can you give a little bit of background?
Yeah, so we started the Historic Vineyard Society. Wow, it's crazy because it's been over a decade now. But basically, it was a group of winemakers that kind of specialize in old vines. It was Mike Officer from Carlisle, Tegan Passalacqua, the winemaker at Turley, David Gates from Ridge, who I just call Yoda because he knows everything, and subsequently Bob Bialy has joined us from Bialy. And basically we were at this point where we were seeing a lot of old vineyards being ripped out around California, like after Sideways came out in the early 2000s. It became a really dangerous time to be an old vine Zinfandel vineyard in Russian River Valley and other areas, because a lot of people were seeing the sort of boom that was going on for Pinot at the time, and they were pretty quick to rip out some pretty amazing old vineyards. And so we looked at that and we're like, well, that sucks. But then on top of that, we looked at the state writ large and we're like, we actually don't have any knowledge of how many old vineyards we have left, and like what type of resource we're losing. Like, is this just a drop in the bucket, or is this something that's really pretty really special? And the thing about old vines is, like, if they've survived multiple wars and changing consumer taste and prohibition and all that, there is a bit of like a Darwinian element of survival. They're probably pretty good. It's not a guarantee, but like there's a higher chance of it. So it's just always like, it's always feels like a little more tragic when you see an old vineyard sort of have to hit the scrap heap. And then at the same time, that dovetailed with a lot of vine mapping that at the time that Mike Officer and I were doing, in particular, where we were going through all of our old vineyards and mapping things vine by vine down to the variety. And we discovered, working with the lab at UC Davis, that we discovered within 2 years of mapping vineyards, we discovered over 65 different varieties in these old vineyards, some of which are essentially extinct where they originally came from in the old world. Some of them have no matching genetic fingerprint, so they literally only exist here, and there's no match in worldwide genetic databases. So it's like, not only are these old vineyards like pretty amazing in terms of the wine quality, but they're also like this kind of incredible genetic resource that people are just kind of like pulling out without realizing that it's like, wow, that may have been one of the last 3 vines left of Grec Rouge in the world, or something like that. So that was another part of it. So, the overall goal of the HES is just to raise awareness of old vines. In sort of pre-COVID times, we would always have like a yearly event where we would enable people to have like boots on the ground and actually like walk through these old vineyards, which is just, there's really nothing like it. There's, you can see Monterosso on the label of something for years, but until you actually like walk and like look down and realize that your pants are red because the soil is just so iron rich there, and that you're surrounded by these incredible like 130-year-old Medusa head vines of Zinfandel, like that really like makes things hit home a little bit more. So we do stuff like that. And we also, like, one of our main fundraisers, which is really fun, is also we annually put together a wine, like 25 cases basically, of a blend from multiple producers from either a specific vineyard or a region, and then like sell that. So it's like, it's kind of fun in that front. And then we also do like outreach to universities. So we do tastings with Vitis. So basically all like the people that are about to graduate in V&E from UC Davis. We've been working with a professor down at Cal Poly SLO. And, because, without sort of like excitement or enthusiasm or awareness from those people that are going to be coming out and taking our jobs in 10, 20, 30 years, hopefully longer than that. It's, we need to sort of like continue that thread of knowledge and appreciation.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is super cool is that diversity that you found. I mean, I remember when we were first exploring Bacarez, you were like, oh yeah, we found that. Like,
yeah, Brun, or also known as Brun Argenté.
Yeah.
So
like the fact that these grapes that barely exist even in their homelands are in California. Like, you think of how sophisticated really the California wine, calling it an industry is maybe a little strong, but whatever, the California wine community was at the end of the fact that you, through these historic vineyards, you have like of that was. I think that's that you can kind of get a piece of these.
Yeah, so you broke up a little bit there on me, but I think I understood the gist of what you're saying. But I mean, and yeah, it's incredible the intrepidness of people that were in this industry in the 19th century, and like the lengths that they went to secure budwood from the old world, and being like, what's going to work here? And if you read the text at the time, they're like, well, we live in a Mediterranean environment, like, well, let's be looking at this. And the trials, I mean, the early 1890s trials that Hilgard was doing on all these different varieties is kind of amazing. Like, it's like, it really is like, everything from Rafosco to Barbera to Grenache to Mourvèdre to, to Charbonne, to like all the more normal stuff. But like, they were actually like talking about these varieties as these varieties in the 1880s and 1890s. It just makes you wonder, like, there's like a lost generation of knowledge with prohibition, right, in many ways. And it's so much. And you read even like Bialetti and some of the professors from the 1930s and 40s, and they were like trying to like recapture all this information and research that had been done back in the 1880s and 1990s. But there's almost like this cold restart in the 30s and 40s in the California wine industry. And it just sort of makes you wonder what things would look like if that hadn't happened.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. The one of the things that sent me, I wrote a blog about it, which I shared with people yesterday, was that that document by Philip Wetmore talking about kind of what had showed great potential for California in '84 or something like that.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, Charles, that was the 1884 ampelography.
And talking about Mourvèdre, which he said he couldn't think of many vineyards in California that wouldn't be improved by the addition of 10 to 75% Mourvèdre. Like,
Yes.
and then of course Mourvèdre gets sidelined by phylloxera. It turns out to be a difficult grafting partner. It gets largely replaced in places like Chateauneuf by Grenache,
Yeah.
and like you have this whole like sliding doors alternate history that you can imagine happening if phylloxera doesn't happen or if prohibition doesn't happen. And yet, like, despite all of that, I feel like you're offering windows into what could be, like, not just what could have been, but what could be, which I think is just fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's some incredible sort of time capsule element to it, and also like being able to tell a more richly contextualized story about these old vineyards is really, I think, important in some ways, because it kind of gives you a different sense of a different flavor profile of California, basically.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, we're now looking at these vineyards, and we face as we face climate change, as we face, the challenges that we need to be like looking at over the next 20 or 30 years, I'm looking at old varieties in some of these vineyards that I'm like, maybe we should be looking at like planting a little bit more Cab Pfeffer or Negrette or stuff like that. It's like these things that seem to actually weather the heat events really well, or hold acidity, or maybe like bud out a little bit later, as we've been sort of seeing earlier bud break in certain vineyards that have put us at greater frost exposure. It's just sort of like so in some ways, I think one of the biggest and most important things about the genetic diversity of these places, that it gives us like a potential toolbox to go back to as we're thinking about what we're going to redevelop. And I think it's equally important to go back and be like, okay, what's working well in the Douro, or what's working well, in Corsica. I think that's very important too. But I think the fact that we also kind of have like a bunch of tools at our hands here that like happily are still present in some of our old vineyards. And that's the other part of what Historic Vineyard Society has been doing, which I should mention, is we've been actually working with Davis to create, it will be open sourced once they're all cleaned up, but basically California selections of a lot of these varieties that we're finding in old vineyards. So it's like, like even here at Bedrock, we have Cabernet that was planted in 1888. So like, is that more interesting to use if we're going to redevelop some Cab than, an Entav clone that was brought over from Bordeaux 15 years ago? I don't know. It seems so to me, at least. So, and that's a main one. But then, of course, we have things like Saint-Macaire and our selections of Syrah and Grenache and Mourvedre. So, I mean, that's all that should be pretty cool.
So how many vineyards are you working with now for Bedrock?
Very hard to pin me down on this question, but we're working with close to 30 vineyards, and actually probably a little bit more than that now because we've expanded a bit into Santa Barbara for Syrah, which is sort of like not obviously in the old vine spectrum, but kind of like another part of what we do. But we work with we're heavily situated in Sonoma County, but we do have like the oldest vineyard left in Oakville that we farm, all 2.5 acres of it. That's actually based around Negrette, next to Tocolon. It's awesome. But then we're in Amador County. We have a couple of vineyards we farm in Contra Costa County, and then we're even headed down into like Santa Clara and the Cienega Valley. So the reality is there's not a ton of old vine vineyards left. So we kind of take in a larger geographic expanse just to, to be able to work with them. And frankly, as we see with fires and everything, like it wasn't done on purpose, but being geographically diverse has been really beneficial the last few years. So, if it wasn't for like Contra Costa County, 2020 would have been really, really tough for us. Just we wouldn't have had any wine to see, like very little wine to sell.
So given all of this, what's next? Like what new stuff are you working on, or what stuff are you thinking about working on that you're excited about?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I'm sure you can relate to, and I know you can because we've talked about it, but it's you get to this point where you're like, okay, this is actually going to be a business that survives. Like you get to that point and then you're like, okay, now we're a business that's had some success and we actually maybe have a little bit of bandwidth to like not just focus on like survival. Let's like figure out like where we go next. And then you get to the point where you can like start fine tuning things. And for us, we're really getting to the point where we can fine tune things. And so a lot of it is maybe less draconian, but as I mentioned to you, we really are very impressed by the regenerative organic cert that you guys got, and I think it's one of the very first certifications that really encapsulates a lot of the stuff that I care about, in terms of the fact that like, and you've written about this wonderfully, but Demeter, organics, they all have their weak spots, and they're weak enough things that it like to go through the hoops to get them just didn't quite click. But I think looking at Bedrock Vineyard, which we farmed de facto organically for years, to move towards that was something we're really excited about, and and just continuing to look about like tillage, carbon sequestration. I know I'm excited, and and like what we can do there, and then also like how we fine tune, and frankly also like there's some really, really popular vineyards that we work with where we've just kind of hit a breaking point with the way that they're farming and that they just won't actually farm. And it's really hard to being like, this is the reason why we're like killing ourselves paying tens of thousands of dollars for these vine row implements to take care of weeds in our organic vineyard. And yet this vineyard over here, somehow we're looking the other way as they're like bombing it with like, pre-emergent herbicide and everything else. And unfortunately, some of those vineyards are popular wines that we make, but I think that we're also getting this point where it's like, okay, what's really important to us? Right. And we, and sales aren't the end all be all of everything. So at some point we have to, we're looking at, we're sort of making some adjustments on that front. And then just in general, it's also like, how do we, from a business side, like how, like we've always run Bedrock very much like a family. Like we have very little turnover in terms of people that work for us. And it's sort of like you read about like how companies like Patagonia and North Face and others are run. Like how do we evolve as a company as more and more of us actually grow up and like have kids of our own? Like how do we look at that stuff? So it's just sort of like, how can we, continue to just sort of better and perfect ourselves in some ways. So I think that that's sort of like the big writ large thing. And then on top of that, like we've got areas of bedrock that were planted to like Bordeaux varieties in the mid 90s and early 2000s that have a lot of virus that, you know, we need to redevelop. And so there it's like, what's fun is we're now starting to look at like planting varieties that I think are going to do really well in a warm Mediterranean climate. You know, instead of a bunch of virus Cab Franc that wasn't very good, you know, I'm pretty excited to see what Gadeo, Vermentino, and Albarino do. And with, you know, reds, we're planting field blends based around Touriga Nacional and things like that. So, you know, just trying to like start experimenting, trying to take maybe a bit of that 1880s, 1890s ethos and sort of reapply it maybe a bit more strategically, but just sort of also kind of like what works, because it's going to be really tough if we turn around in 30 years and be like, well, nothing we were doing is working anymore. You kind of like want to try to get upstream of that.
Yep.
So
yeah, it's exciting. It's exciting to feel like you're in a position that you can step back, take that bigger picture look. And it can't be easy feeling like you're there after the last couple of years. I know
yeah,
a lot of ways that we expected to bring our wines to our customers over the last couple of years. And I'm sure you've had to do the same thing.
Yeah. No, I mean, from a business standpoint, the last 2 to 3 years, I mean, between fires, between COVID, between now, like all the myriad supply chain issues that we're dealing with, you know, it's like, you know, it's it's like we have to have these constant adjustments. So like, it's really like, how do you keep track of the big picture stuff while also like dealing with the fact that, like, you know, it used to be that making sure our glass was going to arrive on time was 2 emails. Now it's like 12. And it's like, and oh, maybe it's not, you know, we were really, really pleased because, you know, 2 years ago, we had made the decision to move to a much more local California glass supplier that was using like almost 60% recycled glass. Like it like massively lowered our overall carbon footprint. We were really excited about it. But that glass supplier has now had 2 of their plants go down. Like they literally are like 12 months out, can't like even like, you know, confirm that they're going to be able to provide glass. So it's like at some point we're like, you know, scrambling to be like, okay, that's the perfect, but then we also like need to like be able to like
Right.
get wine into bottles. So it's like, how do you balance all of that stuff? So I mean, the last couple of years, I mean, as I don't need to tell you, it's like there's been a lot of challenges on a lot of different stuff, and costs are going up, you know, significantly as well. So it's like, how do we do that, and then how do we absorb those, and then also figure out how to like not, you know, how to be sustainable as a business still too. So there's many questions to be answered over the next couple of years.
Yeah. I mean, from our glass supplier, that the Magnum bottle that we've used for the last, well, forever, since we started making Magnums years ago, their next molding is going to be a year from now, and they have inventory, and so any bottling is great. So, and
Yep.
tiny little, there's going to be a lot of that kind of dodge and hunting, coming up with alternatives and fallback plans and all of that over.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think for this most recent bottling, it wasn't our label supplier. We were fine on the paper, but it was the spooling paper on the backing that they couldn't get. And it's just sort of like, you know, you're just like, where did that come from? So it's just like, it's something.
Cool. Okay. Well, I could do this all afternoon. But I do try to keep these to half an hour, and I want to be sensitive to your time. So,
Yeah.
if people want to learn more about Bedrock, or learn more about the Historic Vineyard Society, what's the best way for them to do that?
So Bedrock, obviously, good old website, but we put a lot, just like you, we put a lot of thought into the website. If anything, I've written too much for it. But yeah, so you can get any number of thoughts and my musings there. Also, like with the breakdown of all the vineyards we work with. Historic Vineyard Society is historicvineyardsociety.org. And, you know, and then obviously HVS has, you know, an Instagram presence, as do I, as does our winery, as does my wonderful business partner, Chris, who has Under the Wire. So, you know, so there's any number of ways to follow us there. So feel free to do that. And then every once in a while I'll go on Twitter, but it's mainly just to see what you posted. So, and avoid my doomsday scrolling tendencies. So,
Yeah, there's some of that up there for sure.
yeah. So, yeah. Oh, and every once in a while I'll pop onto Facebook to see what my mom's doing.
Excellent. Cool. Well, again, this has been a total pleasure. Thank you. Oh, right. Somebody just pointed out, and your podcast. You should.
Oh, yeah, of course. Sorry. Which you have been a guest on, which is still one of our most our listened to podcasts. But yeah, Chris, I would say it's our podcast, but it's really Chris. Like Chris and I will talk about it, and we'll talk about our releases and stuff. But he's just become an incredible podcast host, and he's had some really incredible guests on. We just had Carol Meredith on, who's like the great vine geneticist. And that one's amazing if you want to hear how like you too can like be basically a stoner at Lake Berryessa and then become the world's leading grape geneticist. Listen to that. And then, everybody from Graham McDonald to Will Buckland to, we really get into some pretty, the idea is to get more intensively into some, winery and farming topics. So definitely listen to the podcast.
Yeah, it's awesome. Really enjoy it. Cool. Okay. Well, thank you, Morgan. Thank you, Tablas Creek listeners, watchers. I hope you all enjoyed this. Morgan, good luck with the rest of the winter. Good luck with the bottling. Fingers crossed for rain.
Yes.
And I hope I see you in real life soon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jason. And likewise, fingers crossed for more rain. Can never get too much of a good thing.
Awesome. Okay. Bye, everybody. I will see you again in 2 weeks. Again, this has been Morgan Twain Peterson with Bedrock Wine Company. And thanks again, Morgan. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jason.